Marc, how are you?
Thanks for doing this, and Chris, thank you as well.
Thank you. And Marc, let me just start out by thanking you for all the effort and generosity you've shown towards both Brigham and Women's and Mass General Hospital, both serving on the boards, and the Lurie Foundation, which you have supported over time. So thank you very much.
Peter, it's been a pleasure. Just the most amazing organization, Mass General Brigham. It's phenomenal in terms of the contributions to society.
So, Marc, let's start on the issue of testing. You and I have talked a little bit about, the importance of testing, and that we're dealing with both a medical issue, but also a psychological issue of people feeling comfortable to use the healthcare system, but also to go back to work, et cetera. So I thought if you could just talk about, just worldwide, but even for Thermo itself, how you think about dealing with both the medical and the, quote, psychological or fear issue that people have these days.
Yeah, so Peter, as you go from the first phase of really, fighting the pandemic and really entirely from a healthcare perspective, as we go from that phase to, a more aggressive reopening of the economy, people have been, basically been shelter in place now for a couple months. And, one of the things that I believe is going to be important from a psychological perspective is that people, believe it's going to be comfortable, safe to return to work in a, away from the home environment. And because of that, testing is going to play a significant role until we have, certainly vaccines or, widely available therapies to address the pandemic. So I think that, employers are going to wind up having to have a workplace testing strategy as well. Not all of them, in some states and countries will provide that as well, but I think it's becoming an important part of the dialogue and how you get from shelter in place to a more return to work environment.
And how do you see testing developing, Marc, to give people the confidence in, A, that there's enough supplies out there to do the testing, but people hear a lot these days about positive and negative results and what it means, and just wonder if you could talk a little about how Thermo is looking at that these days.
Yeah, so in terms of the PCR testing, right, whether you have the virus now, one of the goals that we've had, and I know the industry has had, is not only to ramp up, the availability of tests in this first phase of fighting the pandemic, but also to have enough supply available to address a more normal return to work environment. And if I look at, our own capacity, we went from effectively zero production prior to mid-March to over 5 million tests a week that we're producing. And as we exit May, it'll be over 10 million tests a week. So, and that will continue to ramp further as we, prepare for the end of the summer. So we're not the only company doing this. So we expect that, PCR-based testing is going to be much more available. And states are developing strategies here in the U.S. and countries are doing the same. And then obviously antibody testing will also become much more widely available as the next couple of months unfold. I think that combination means that the supply side, while it's still being constrained somewhat, is going to be very different than what we experienced over the last 2 months.
Marc, you mentioned the supply chain in your comments, and just the supply chain worldwide and meeting the needs of this pandemic has been an issue. And, when we were preparing and we talked, I told you about some of the issues we faced with, 5 or 10-fold increases in pricing, the whole disrupted nature of the supply chain. I wonder if you could just talk about from what Thermo has seen and what you see is the major changes that will hit the supply chain coming out of this.
Yeah, so Peter, I think that you're going to have, different phases of this, right? And we obviously saw a phase where PPE was just incredibly short supply relative to demand, and you had all sorts of challenges with shortages and prices, and and as you think about the future from a supply chain perspective, I think you're going to see a couple themes. One is Clearly, there'll be more preparedness, and that's a good thing. But also, you're going to see companies really test the robustness of their supply chain. We're going through that ourselves and making sure that we continue to have really strong second sources, multiple country sources to have robust supply chain. And we've been fortunate through this pandemic in terms of the reliability of our supply chain, but we're prepared for more challenging times. I think the one interesting thing is I think supply chain disruption is not going to be a short-term phenomenon and just be done. If you think about pharmaceuticals and the active pharmaceutical ingredient production, those things usually don't show up for like a year after the disruption happens. So if I think about issues in the medical supply chain from a pharmaceutical perspective, I think the challenges that we may face are still well down the road. And as inventories get utilized and get stabilized. So I think we'll be talking about supply chain robustness for the foreseeable future.
How do you think the whole issue of the focus on buying supplies in China, the Far East, India, et cetera, versus domestically, what kind of dialogue do you expect to see on that over the next year? Because there's real issues that underlie. There's a reason the supply chain is the way it is now.
Yeah, so I think we live in an interconnected world. And I'll give you an example. One of the activities we do as a company is we often do the sterile fill finish of biologics and vaccines. So once there's a successful medicine, we do the final dosage form. And a number of countries have come to us and said, "Hey, we would love to have this capability in our country." And if you think about it, it's just not practical, right? We live in a global supply chain. If a small country, everyone wants their own, or each state wants their own, it's just not going to happen, right? We're going to need to have a level of free flow of goods. I think that clearly there'll be opportunities for supply chains to rebalance, and you may see other countries gain, more new activity as there's been concerns with certain countries. But I don't see a wholesale shifting of, large-scale manufacturing coming back to Western Europe or the U.S. as part of this. I think it's going to be more selective than that.
What do you think's going to happen? You mentioned the pharmaceutical concerns, the regular medical and surgical supplies. How do you think people are going to rethink stockpiling and having, like when I look at us, one of the lessons I've taken out of this is we clearly have to build a 3 to 4 month stockpile. And that's an expensive one-time charge, but after you do it, you can rotate it through. Curious what you're hearing people discuss about that.
Yeah, I would say you've got, a couple different dynamics going on. One is that, governments are going to need to focus on stockpiling as well, right? Because no matter how good a strategy is at an institution, if you start to get down to each company or each hospital, there's always going to be some that just don't do a great job or don't have the financial wherewithal to do it, right? Even though it may be the right thing to do. So I think governments play a huge role in this. And I do think that we've all learned a lesson on, minimal inventory supply, just in time, deliveries, those kinds of things that we plan for. When there's shocks to the system, they don't work so well. And I think you're going to see, a gradual rebuild of inventories as well to prepare for, the next future issues. So I think it's going to be a blend of both. And I do hope that governments step in here. It would be a lot more efficient for governments to do the stockpiling than asking every single institution to do that.
And it'll be interesting. In order for that to work effectively, people will have to have faith in the methodology by which the government builds the stockpile and how it would distribute in the future, because that's the real key to giving everyone confidence it would work.
Yeah, I mean, the allocation methodology has been very challenging because demand had far outstripped supply. So I don't think anybody was happy, and ultimately until the supply came more in balance with the demand equation. So I do think that the stronger institutions are going to, whether or not government stockpile, are still going to do more inventory planning as a lessons learned out of this for sure. And we will as a company also, right? I mean, as we think about it, that'll be one of the things that, the lessons learned we have. Where did we see constraints within the robustness of our own supply chains and what adjustments will we make, and we'll make some for sure.
So, Mark, let's turn to our respective workforces and talk about how this has impacted them, both the remote work from home, people's ability to get their jobs done, and, how that's been for Thermo and how you see it changing how Thermo will operate in the future, if at all.
Yeah, so Peter, this is one where we've learned a tremendous amount, right? And we have a large business in China serving the Chinese market. So we've been living in a COVID-19 world directly, since January, right? In terms of, how we operate and, and it's as it spread across the world, we've seen, how to respond to that. I think there's a few things that, are very clear, which is, one, social distancing and reducing, employee density in our facilities is something that will be a norm for a while, right? And we've been able to keep all of our sites, all of our distribution and manufacturing sites have remained opened throughout this pandemic. And roughly, a third of our 75,000 colleagues have been coming to work at a Thermo Fisher site during the course of this pandemic, right? So the keeping them safe, wearing PPE, going through all of the, various, filling out the questionnaires, temperature checking, and dealing with those things have worked well for us. And we've also learned a lot from a work from home standpoint. The first thing is that I think most companies have come to this experience. You can do a lot more work from home than any company ever imagined. But one of the challenges is that while productivity has been good, the quality of life for colleagues, not Thermo Fisher specific, the work from home, environment isn't necessarily ideal either, right? And a lot of our colleagues have said, they look forward to being able to return to a site because people are working longer hours. There's no delineation between home and work, and that gets stressful after 2 months. And when I think about, the people management side of our business, we want to retain our colleagues for bright careers. And I think getting the balance of how much work is done from home and how much is done from the office needs to shift from where we are today because, I think over time, people will burn out if everything is in this work from home environment. So that's something different than what I would have said a month ago, where everyone was like, this is super great in terms of being able to keep things going. I think there's the consequences of there's real benefits of our sites and getting some people back when it's safe to do so.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. There's the classic term 24/7, and many times executives say I'm working 24/7 and all that. But the reality of life is we all are human beings from the top to the bottom of any organization. And that ability to get personal time separate is really, really important. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing we learn out of this. I think the other thing we've learned is how dependent the workforce is on basic infrastructure, things such as transportation, child care, et cetera. How do you think we deal with that as a society going forward? Not that either one of us has the answer to that, but that's going to be a really key thing in ramping back up and everything.
Yeah, I think especially as you have sites or businesses in urban locations where you are highly dependent on public transportation, and you are highly dependent on elevators as a in-site way of moving, social distancing becomes super challenging, right? If your sites aren't in those venues, it's more practical, and I think that actually is going to be one of the real challenges about how do you get back to a more degree of normalcy. And I think creating new norms and a safe way of doing that is going to be one of the bigger challenges that we face from a societal standpoint. I think, Peter, it's probably worth maybe you making a comment or two from your own perspective, given the size of Mass General Brigham, on how you're thinking about that, return to more normalcy for those folks that have been working from home.
Yeah, I think that is going to be a challenge, and different portions of our population use mass transit more than others do, and we're going to have to figure that out. Parking is a huge issue in urban environments, so how do we work that? I think in different areas, healthcare, the hospitals, they're working, 2 or 3 shifts, a day of people coming in and out. How do we deal with that? I think the biggest issue we're going to face in general is how do we make people feel safe, and how do we help people balance these working from home transitions they're going to have to go through. And, it's not just, one spouse in many cases. It's 2 spouses dealing with this. It's how our kids going to react and develop. So I think there's 2 things we're very focused on. One is this pure fear factor, and how do we help employees overcome that? But the other is a real mental health, and you can argue the 2 are related. How do you deal with all the different things you have to adapt to? Some people do better with change than others. I think this is more change than most people are used to dealing with. And so how do you get the workforce to lean on each other, work with each other, and how do we start to get people to feel comfortable that yes, there's a new disease we have to deal with. We're all working. And, the frontline staff is exhausted for the most part right now. So as we go to redeploy people and ramp back up, how do we deal with those issues? But they're really just basic human issues at the end of the day.
Yeah,
so, Mark, we only have a little.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a huge challenge on the next phase for sure in terms of managing people well.
Right. So, Mark, let me give you the last 3.5 minutes we have left to talk about how you think all of this is going to reshape the healthcare industry at the end of the day. None of us have a crystal ball, but I think we'd just be all interested in hearing how you view the global change possibilities.
Yeah, I think you're going to see enormous changes, of which we obviously haven't, connected all the dots. I think one of the things that will be very clear, if you thought about telemedicine and the challenge of the ramp of that historically, very modest adoption, I think the leading, academic medical centers and the leading institutions are going to wind up having much more access to patients because care can often be given locally if you get the right diagnosis and the right approach to patients. And I think that people have gotten comfortable with telemedicine because of the situation that we were in. And I think that will be a positive in terms of the impact on society. So I think that's something to look forward to. I think clearly there's going to be significant investment from a government perspective in healthcare infrastructure as well, in terms of supporting and building a more robust environment around the world to address, the shortcomings that we all identified. And I think that will bode well from, having a more resilient, healthcare system going forward. And I think it's going to take a lot of years to undo the damage financially, right, to the healthcare system from this period as well, right? And there's an economic challenge that we went through. And there's also going to be all of the human challenge of just the amazing work that healthcare workers have done around the world to respond to this. People are exhausted, right? It's going to take a while to, regain the energy to fight the next wave and the next thing. And I think those are all going to have major implications going forward. But I'm always an optimist, and I see the good, and I believe that ultimately there'll be good that comes out of it, along with some challenges that we'll have to navigate.
One last comment, and you said this very well earlier. We are a global world. Technology, you can't reverse technology. So how do you see us using technology? You and I have talked, and you mentioned that the diagnostic and protocol is really what it's about, and care can be delivered anywhere. Just as you look at through the eyes of your business, how do you see the international world dealing with this at the end of the day?
Yeah, I do believe that across the globe, the acceleration of knowledge sharing across the globe from a healthcare perspective coming out of this is going to be enormous, right? The amount of dialogue that we've had with health ministers in different countries, whether it's low income, middle income, the most developed countries, I think that acceleration to raising the standard for everyone is going to be one of the outcomes, right? And technology is going to play a big role in that, and I'm encouraged by that going forward. So I think that that'll be one of the real benefits of coming out of what's been a brutally challenging time.
Great. So, Mark, thank you very much for taking the time to do this, and thank you for everything Thermo is doing for both us and the world in general. So thank you very much, Chris. I'll turn it back to you.